2 days. That's all that's left before Trump's 50% tariffs hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And Canada's own chief negotiator just delivered a warning blunt enough that 5 separate sources felt compelled to leak it to the press. Janice Charette told the U.S. trade representative directly, in a closed-door meeting, that crossing this deadline wouldn't just be another round of economic pain, it would be a cliff, one that could halt these negotiations entirely. A former Canadian diplomat put it even more starkly on live television this week, saying he doesn't know how this ends, but right now it looks like it's going to end in tears. This is a trade relationship standing right at the edge, and Canada just made sure Washington knows exactly how close that edge actually is. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll break down exactly what's on the table right now, the $20 billion in exports, the specific products at risk, and why this round is more dangerous than anything that's come before it. Then we'll get into Charette's cliff warning itself, straight from sources briefed on the closed-door meeting with USTR Jamieson Greer. After that, we'll cover Carney's own public tone shift this week, from cautious diplomacy to something noticeably tougher. We'll look at the strange split happening in real time, cautious optimism from some reporting, stark warnings of impasse from others, and what that tells you about how fragile this actually is. And finally, we'll talk about what happens to industries on both sides of the border if this clock actually runs out. Let's start with the stakes. Trump's threatened 50% tariffs would hit roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian exports, covering everything from hockey sticks and wine to dairy products, cement, and plywood. These tariffs stack directly on top of tariffs Trump has already imposed on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forestry products, meaning entire sectors of the Canadian economy would be facing compounding, overlapping duties rather than a single new hit. Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec are expected to absorb the sharpest damage, the same provinces already carrying the weight of this trade war for over a year. The deadline lands August 19th, and as of this week, according to CBC News reporting relayed through NBC, the two countries were sitting at an impasse, with Carney himself describing the talks to reporters as very delicate and intense. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this particular list of targeted goods actually is, because it reveals something about the strategy behind it. Hockey sticks and wine aren't randomly chosen products. They're symbolically loaded, deliberately touching both Canadian cultural identity and a sector, alcohol, where Canada's own provincial boycotts have already inflicted real, documented damage on American producers. Cement and plywood, meanwhile, hit directly at construction costs on both sides of the border, meaning American home builders and contractors would feel this just as immediately as Canadian exporters would. This isn't a narrow surgical tariff targeting some obscure industrial input nobody notices. It's broad enough to touch ordinary consumers and everyday industries simultaneously, which is exactly why the political stakes on both sides have gotten so heated so quickly. Now here's the warning that's been rippling through Washington and Ottawa all week. According to 5 separate sources briefed on the discussions, Charette told Greer directly in a meeting that if the White House goes ahead with these tariffs on the 19th, it represents what she called a cliff, a moment that risks halting trade talks altogether. She reportedly cautioned American officials specifically about the public mood inside Canada, warning that Ottawa would not be able to rein in or control how the public and the provincial premiers react if these tariffs actually land. One source close to the discussions put it even more directly: a Canadian retaliation would almost certainly provoke a counter-retaliation from Trump, ratcheting up an already bruising trade war even further, which is exactly why Charette pushed the message that right now is the window to actually get a deal done, not after the tariffs hit, and both sides are locked into an escalating spiral. Think carefully about what it means for a senior government negotiator to deliver a message like that through official, on-the-record channels detailed enough for 5 separate sources to independently confirm it to reporters. This isn't leaked gossip or an anonymous social media post. This is a structured, deliberate diplomatic signal, precise enough in its wording that multiple people in the room walked away with the same clear understanding of what was being communicated. Governments don't accidentally let a warning that specific reach 5 different sources. That kind of consistency across multiple briefings suggests Ottawa wanted this message to travel, wanted Washington's own trade apparatus to understand exactly how seriously Canada is treating this particular deadline compared to every other pressure point that's come before it in this trade war. And there's a very specific demand sitting at the center of why this remains unresolved. According to industry sources, it was made clear to Greer that there is simply no way the federal government can push provinces to put American alcohol back on store shelves without comprehensive, meaningful tariff relief for industries like steel and aluminum first. That's Canada telling Washington plainly, you don't get the concession you want most until you deliver the relief we need most, a real negotiating position, not a bluff dressed up as one. Remember, this specific boycott has already been documented in the White House's own paperwork as having cost American alcohol producers more than $580 million in a single year. Provinces aren't giving that leverage back cheaply, and the federal government in Ottawa has essentially told Washington it doesn't have the political authority to force them to, even if it wanted to. Carney's own public tone has shifted noticeably too. Speaking in Toronto earlier this month, he warned that Canada will get tougher with the United States if there's no agreement before the deadline, telling reporters the tone right now is pretty tough, and that Canada is prepared to do everything necessary if no deal materializes by August 19th. That's a meaningful shift from the calm, measured language he used back in July when the tariffs were first announced. As the clock has run down, so has Carney's patience with keeping that tone purely diplomatic. It's a notable evolution too, given how consistently restrained Carney's public messaging had been throughout most of this dispute, choosing careful, controlled language even when facing an unprecedented tariff tool and blunt accusations from Washington's own trade office. The fact that even Carney, of all people, is now using words like tough suggests the private negotiations behind closed doors have grown considerably more strained than the public record alone would suggest. Here's where the story gets genuinely tense to watch in real time, because the reporting itself keeps flip-flopping day to day. The Washington Post reported this past week that the two sides were inching closer to a deal, citing industry executives and trade specialists following the talks closely. Yet within 48 hours, CBC was reporting an actual impasse, and Trump himself, in earlier comments before departing for Scotland, told reporters he hasn't had a lot of luck with Canada, and suggested this could simply end up being a straight tariff situation rather than a negotiated settlement at all. Meanwhile, on the ground in Washington this week, when reporters shouted questions at Greer as he left a meeting with Canadian negotiators, all he offered was no comment, before switching to French just long enough to say a polite goodbye to a Radio Canada reporter and walking away. That's not the body language of officials confident they've already got this locked down. This kind of contradictory reporting, optimism one day, impasse warnings the next, isn't necessarily a sign that either outlet is getting it wrong. It's more likely a genuine reflection of how volatile these closed doctor talks actually are day to day. Multiple sources close to the negotiations have described the atmosphere as intense and delicate, language that suggests both delegations are moving through real progress on some fronts while hitting genuine roadblocks on others, all happening in parallel, with the public only catching fragments of each shift as it happens. That volatility itself is worth understanding as part of the story, not just noise to filter out because it tells you this deadline isn't simply theater. Both sides appear to be genuinely uncertain, in real time, about which direction this actually breaks. To be fair, both sides clearly want this resolved without the tariffs actually landing. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has said plainly that negotiations are continuing. Carney has said he expects to speak with Trump directly before the deadline, and U.S. officials themselves have expressed optimism. A deal can still be reached by the 19th, their main worry reportedly being whether they can sell whatever agreement gets struck back to their own political base. This isn't a story of two countries refusing to talk, it's a story of two countries racing against a self-imposed clock while genuinely disagreeing on sequencing. Does relief come before the concession, or after? But listen to how Canadian voices across the political spectrum are framing this moment, because there's real unity in the tone, even without unity on tactics. Shuvaloy Majumdar, the conservative critic for Canada-US relations, said Ottawa's political class is united across party lines on securing a deal with what he called an often unpredictable administration in Washington, adding bluntly that Canada has grown tired of being used as a punching bag. That's not language reserved for one party or one premier anymore. That's becoming the consensus framing across Canadian politics as a whole. When opposition critics start using the exact same framing as the sitting prime minister's government, that's usually a sign the underlying frustration has moved beyond partisan politics into something closer to genuine national consensus, regardless of which party happens to be negotiating on Canada's behalf at any given moment. So that's where things stand with the clock running out. Canada's own negotiator has told Washington directly that this deadline is a cliff, not just another pressure point. A former diplomat is publicly predicting this could end badly, and Carney's own tone has hardened from cautious diplomacy into open talk of getting tougher if no deal lands in time. There's a strategic logic behind Charrette's framing worth sitting with for a second. Calling something a cliff rather than just another deadline is a deliberate choice of language. It tells Washington that this isn't a threshold you can cross and simply walk back from later with a friendlier phone call. Colin Robertson, the former diplomat who helped negotiate both the original NAFTA and its successor CUSMA, laid out exactly why that distinction matters strategically, arguing Canada's current negotiating team needs to match Washington's own playbook precisely, offering reversible responses to reversible tariff threats, while reserving any truly permanent concessions for gains that are just as durable on the American side. That's not the language of a country bluffing its way through a deadline. That's the language of negotiators who've done this exact dance before and know precisely how much leverage sits in the difference between a temporary threat and a permanent commitment. One last thing worth remembering as this plays out over the next 48 hours. Whatever happens on the 19th, this moment is already a data point. Future negotiations will reference. If Canada holds its position and a deal gets struck at the last possible minute, that becomes evidence that calm, coordinated pressure works against an unpredictable administration. If the tariffs land anyway and talks genuinely freeze the way Charrette warned they might, that becomes evidence of exactly the opposite, that no amount of careful diplomacy changes the outcome once Washington has already decided on escalation. Either way, the next trade dispute, whether it's Canada again or some other country entirely, is going to be shaped by whichever version of this story actually plays out this week. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Do you think a deal gets done before August 19th? Or does this actually go over the cliff Charrette warned Washington about?